Mortal Kombat is a franchise that's been around a while, so maybe there's some stuff we can still learn about it. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 Mortal Kombat facts you probably didn't know. Number 10. Despite being one of the most successful fighting games of all time, the original Mortal Kombat was developed with only 4 people. 4 people developed that game. Like, I'm not gonna go ahead and say it's somehow shocking. Games took way less resources at that point to develop, but at the same time, they used a graphic style that was very different for the time. The animation was very realistic looking because they used people, digitized video. And if you think about it, that had to have been wild to have something that really was not such a big project turn into what it was, because it blew up. The first time I saw a fatality, I was just completely sold. And it was 4 people that brought you that experience. 4, not 40, which would have still been a small team even nowadays. 4. Number 9, did you know that Mortal Kombat was the very first game to get a mature rating by the ESRB, the Entertainment Software Rating Board? But it was kind of expected on account it was a game that was kind of extremely responsible for the ESRB being made in the first place. Interestingly enough, it was specifically the fatalities that did this. There is a copious amount of blood in the original game, and although by today's standards it's in no way even slightly realistic, at the time there was just no blood in video games at all. That wasn't something that anybody ever thought about, and suddenly it was there in their living rooms. The ESRB was created basically because people were so angry they wanted the government to do something, and the video game industry at this point was smart enough that they understood the idea that self-regulation was something they could do. Now they just go for it and try to do whatever they can, waiting on the government to make laws saying they can't, and when it happens, it's going to be more strict than ever. Let me just tell you about what those loot boxes that happened a couple years ago are going to cause if they try to push it like that again. Still, mature. First game, Mortal Kombat. Number 8. Mortal Kombat 2 was such a popular arcade cabinet that deadlocks had to be installed. Let me explain. Back then, you could go to an arcade and Mortal Kombat 2 was there, and everyone was huddled around it because it was the best thing, period. And much like you could rip out your opponent's heart in the game, you could rip the heart of the game out and take it home and plug it into a TV and use it if you were a thief and wanted to destroy everyone's fun. Mortal Kombat 2 was so popular that people such as this appeared and did exactly that, stealing the motherboard out of the back of the cabinet, taking it home, plugging it into the TV, and having Mortal Kombat 2. So in response, they installed deadlock security panels on these machines to stop people from doing that. On the flip side, it was so popular that not only were people trying to steal it, but it was also the first game to surpass Hollywood box office ticket sales. That means it surpassed the intake of every Hollywood blockbuster of that season, which is big. Number 7, Nintendo had a very strict censorship policy. They did not want blood in Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was a kid's toy. It was looked at in a very specific way, and when they licensed Mortal Kombat, it did not have blood in it. And because of this, the Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat outsold the Super Nintendo version 4-1. Sega does what Nintendo don't, kinda came from this. Now, because the Super Nintendo version did not sell nearly as well as the Sega Genesis version, and that was a big problem for Super Nintendo, they were like, alright, we'll change that policy for Mortal Kombat 2. They did, and wouldn't you know it, the Super Nintendo version sold way better this time around. Pretty much on par with the Genesis version from anything I can find. In theory, the original Super Nintendo version had better graphics, but without the blood, it wasn't really Mortal Kombat. That was part of the game. Number 6. When the original Mortal Kombat was first introduced, various debug menus have been found over the years. But back in the original era, a specific menu listed error macros, a debug term, under the name Ermac. Now, this was listed alongside reptile matches, which people thought that made Ermac into another ninja character. This was not true. Ermac was not the second hidden ninja behind Reptile. However, for Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, Midway just went ahead and made Ermac. It was basically just a palette swap of Scorpion, and then in Mortal Kombat Deception, which was quite a bit later, he had a full redesign, and it was actually pretty cool. He also had a special move called Telekinetic Slam, which he could levitate his opponents and then, slam them with his brain. Telekinetic Slam. Mortal Kombat always just feels like talking about simpler times, doesn't it? Number 5. There are some fairly interesting character quirks about the Mortal Kombat characters. For instance, Shang Tsung was based on the Chinese sorcerer Lo Pan from Big Trouble in Little China. Raiden too, although he didn't really have a name in Big Trouble in Little China. Speaking of Raiden, he and Scorpion are the only 2 Mortal Kombat characters who were actually in every single Mortal Kombat game. Now keep in mind Sub-Zero kind of is the same, but not quite. Now there are different Sub-Zeros and Noob Saibot is, the original one. But I'll tell you what's most interesting about this whole character thing. Johnny Cage wasn't in every Mortal Kombat game, and yet, the original Mortal Kombat was based on a game Ed Boon and John Tobias had been making that starred Jean-Claude Van Damme. Johnny Cage is based on the character they were working on in that game. That game, however, didn't get made, it fell through, and they made Mortal Kombat instead. And in some ways, it was inspired by that game. Number 4, in 2008, one of the Jackass and CKY stars, Brandon D. Camillo, actually shattered and held the world high score in arcade Mortal Kombat, which had previously been in the 8 millions, and he posted a score of 10.2 million points. Now, it's really interesting that he was able to shatter it by that much, and people lauded it for being that big of a jump in the score, because a year later, his record was beaten by Isaiah Triforce Johnson, who has the coolest name record as well. I made that up. But he posted a score of 24.8 million points, which is not even in the same hemisphere. It's more than double, which is wild. Also, I'm not as good as any of those people at the original Mortal Kombat game. That's just absolutely wild. Number 3, some goofball decided to stop himself from getting punched in Mortal Kombat in a creative way. Although let's be really clear about what I mean by creative here. It's kind of weird. Not by mentally training himself, coming up with interesting and different attacks to do. No, he punished himself away from it by modding his Xbox controller to give him a 20,000 volt electrical shock whenever he got punched, which I can't imagine actually making you better at the game. Now let's go ahead and say 20,000 volts isn't gonna kill you in any way. If the amperage isn't insane in any way, that's not really that big of a deal. Still, why? What's the point? I promise this didn't make him better at Mortal Kombat. I promise instead it probably made him like Mortal Kombat less. Cause I'm not bad at Mortal Kombat and I still get punched in it. I don't want to get an electric shock every time that happens. I want to just enjoy the game. Number 2, the very first fatality discovered and performed in Mortal Kombat in a public location was done during a location test. It was the first weekend they had brought Mortal Kombat out for people. It was in Times Square Arcade, which was ironically located in Chicago, Illinois, and not Times Square. And a 12-year-old kid was among the first people to have played the game outside of the developers. He apparently wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it something random? Was it something that he had done? And the kid didn't have money to continue experimenting. So when he was telling people about the fatalities, other players in the arcade actually didn't believe him. So this kid actually found John Tobias, one of the developers that was there for the location test, to confirm that it was real. John Tobias actually did a blog post about it in 2012 that's actually a fairly interesting story. It's more generally about that whole thing, but his blog doesn't actually exist anymore, so you have to find it on the archives. Still, interesting information. And finally, number 1. If you want to know why Johnny Cage actually wasn't in Mortal Kombat 3, it's because the actor who played Johnny Cage was paid $50 an hour and didn't sign any kind of royalty agreement, and the game was a huge hit and he didn't get any extra money. Now, that's really super unfair and not cool. He should have gotten something. I feel like everybody probably should have gotten something. And if it was 2019, I get the feeling that that's something that may have been resolved differently. But his response was to try to sue the developers for $10 million, which sounds comical. Like even now, when $10 million is significantly less money than then, it still sounds silly. The same guy also played Scorpion and Sub-Zero. Obviously, they're basically the same sprite, they color swapped it. But he also had a younger brother who played Raiden. Noob, on the other hand, was a blacked out version of Kano's sprite in Mortal Kombat 3 because they didn't want ninja-looking characters in Mortal Kombat 3. And the final weird character tidbit is that Rain is actually based off Prince's Purple Rain. Like, for real, that's a real thing. There you go. There's also a lot of other hidden nuggets to be told about Mortal Kombat. Maybe a good time to brush up on your knowledge, and if you happen to remember any of them, leave us a comment, and just otherwise let us know what you think. If you like this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe, and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.